The polls are predicting a Tory wipeout and a Labour landslide, but not a single vote has yet to be cast.
In spite of the fact it feels like this election has been going on for 17 years. So, how do we make the most of our votes in a broken electoral system? I'm Nish Kumar.
And I'm Coco Khan, and this is PodSafe the UK.
Today, we're joined by pollster Joe Twyman, the Electoral Reform Society's Jessica Garland, and political activist Femi Oluwole. But first...
You didn't care, did you?
No, I cared deeply.
Then why didn't you stay?
As I said, the itinerary for these events was set weeks ago, before the general election campaign. I participated in events both in Portsmouth and in France, and having fully participated in all the British events with British veterans, I returned home before the International Leaders event. That was a mistake, and I apologise for that.
That's Rishi Sunak speaking to Sky News' Sam Coates in possibly the most painful moment of the campaign so far. Now, many of our listeners will have heard about this story already, but it's really worth turning it over. This is a catastrophe for the Tories.
So, yeah, it's been a second disastrous week for, I think, maybe the worst campaign I've ever experienced.
Yeah.
In 2017, Theresa May went into that election that she called with such kind of boisterous confidence because the polls were saying she was good. And then she ran such a bad campaign that she kind of squandered all of her kind of political advantage and ended up narrowly winning the election, but having to go into a kind of confidence and supply arrangement with the DUP to prop up her ailing government. This campaign is even worse. So just to summarise, for people perhaps outside of the UK or for people who've just buried their head in the sand and are trying to not engage with this at all, Rishi Sunak decided to ditch the D-Day ceremonies in Normandy last Friday and instead pre-record an interview with ITV News. So he attended the British events in the morning, but then there was a huge international celebration, which was a pretty significant deal because it's widely assumed to be the last D-Day celebration where there will be people who are actually on the beaches attending. Emmanuel Macron was there, who himself is not short of a couple of political problems at home, but he managed to make the time. Biden was there. Sunak left David Cameron in his stead, who is, let's face it, the ultimate substitute teacher. Keir Starmer actually remained, and there were lots of photos of him with Vladimir Zelensky looking very much like the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It was a catastrophic piece of political miscalculation.
Last week we were talking about how the problems with Diane Abbott and Faiza Shaheen were overshadowing Labour's policy pledges, basically. They couldn't really get any other messaging out. That seems to have kind of curtailed. And in a way, this is the Tories' answer to it. However, we're on D-Day 6 now. I have a feeling this is going to roll on and get bigger and bigger and bigger.
So the reason that he skipped the D-Day celebration was to do an interview with ITV. ITV and the journalist Paul Brand, who gave the interview, have repeatedly reminded the public that D-Day was the only time they were offered by the Conservative Party to interview the Prime Minister. So Paul Brand has gone out of his way to tell us, look, we didn't even want to do it then.
Yeah.
It's the only time we were offered by the Conservative Party. And listen, if there's one golden rule in British politics, you don't fuck with World War II.
So on Tuesday night, ITV began trailing the interview. Here's a taster.
Prime Minister.
Gosh, hello.
Good to see you.
Very nice to see you. Hey, sorry to
I'm
have
well,
kept
thanks
you.
No, not at all. I know you've been in Normandy.
Yeah, it all just ran over. It
Of course.
was incredible, but it just ran over everything.
I'm sure it was
So apologies for keeping you.
ITV, they are absolutely loving sticking the boot in. That's the sound of Rishi Sunak entering the interview room and telling the interviewer that the event had run over.
Yeah.
It was incredible, but it had run over. You skipped most of it, mate.
There were some other tasty morsels in the interview. You probably would have heard people talking about how Rishi Sunak has been saying he had some sacrifices that his family had to make when he was younger. One of them is they didn't have Sky TV, which is obviously very rough. It is worth pointing out that Rishi Sunak is currently richer than the king, though.
Yes, it's quite an extraordinary line to not have a prepared response to. Only because it's probably one of the most famous facts. I'd venture that there's, of our international listenership, a lot of them know that Rishi Sunak is richer than the King of England. It's a line that's consistently trotted out about him and his personal wealth. And it is sort of vaguely incredible that nobody within his campaign team has thought we should probably have an answer for that.
Yeah.
And instead he said, well, we had to give some things up. We didn't have Sky TV. I didn't have Sky TV when I was younger, but nobody's going to paint me as like...
Sky TV.
No, I can't go around going, the hardship of my childhood. Truly, it was hard. You can't, that doesn't portray you as being Oliver Twist.
Well, he is out of touch. I think we can all agree on that. And anyway, yeah, like we've said, this week the Tories were attempting to sell their manifesto.
Yeah.
It's not been a good week for them to get those messages out, but don't worry, because if you missed it in all the D-Day drama, we're going to be talking about it this weekend. We've got a massive manifesto breakdown episode coming your way.
But for now, polling data suggests that the Tories will be facing a wipeout. The latest poll from Sky News and YouGov on Tuesday showed the Tories at 17%. That's only 1 point ahead of Reform at 16%. The Lib Dems polled at 15%, suggesting that the parties are now in a three-way race. What we're potentially facing is
a Conservative wipeout.
Labour and Liberal Democrats on opposite sides of the dispatch box, and the Liberal Democrats being the biggest party in opposition.
So the Tories have been trying to shore up support from defecting voters across the week. Here's Rishi Sunak making his case to voters while speaking to BBC's Nick Robinson on Monday evening.
There's only going to be one of two people who's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer or myself. A vote for anyone who's not a Conservative candidate is just making it more likely that Keir Starmer is that person.
All right, so what's actually going on here is Sunak encouraging the public to vote tactically, not necessarily voting for the candidate you want to vote for. That is a symptom of first past the post. And to learn more about it, I had a chat with Jess Garland from the Electoral Reform Society. So Jess, explain it to me like I'm 5. What is first past the post?
Well, it's taken from horse racing, right? So it's the first horse to get across the line. So it basically means that the winner is the candidate who's got the most votes, but that only needs to be a plurality, doesn't need to be the majority of the votes. They can have one more vote than the second place candidate, or they can have thousands more votes than the second place candidates. Whichever way it goes, it's the person with the plurality that wins. And of course, that means we do get a lot of people winning on 35% of the vote, which is pretty low when it comes to an election result. No one's talking about changing to a first past the post system because it is so flawed in so many ways. And most countries, not just in Europe, but around the world, are using some form of proportional system.
And so because we have this system where you can become Prime Minister and your party can form the government with 30%, 35% of the votes, it's probably not surprising that tactical voting has emerged. If you wouldn't mind, again, for our international listeners and for me, the little 5-year-old inside, what exactly is tactical voting?
Well, tactical voting is basically defined as someone who's going to vote for not their first choice of candidate or party, but another party in order to keep out a party or candidate that they dislike more. So, and this can coalesce around different sort of areas or policies. But essentially, it's like, hold your nose voting.
It's weird when you explain tactical voting, the hold your nose approach, because, quite often the idealistic view would be that you vote for the person or the party that inspires you the most. But under that system, you vote for the one that you hate the least, or certainly one that is not the one you hate the most. It seems to be a system that requires a villain and a bogeyman. Does that sound right?
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like, I think that's a really good description. It feels like quite a negative vote. You're not voting with your heart. You're trying to make a sort of strategic choice to kind of affect an outcome. And of course, when you're making all those decisions, it might not actually have the effect that you think it's going to. And of course, whether tactical voting then actually has an impact on results relies on so many things going in a particular direction that, you can be going to the polling station, not voting with your heart, voting in a way, as you say, to hold your nose, and still it not leading to the outcome that you want it to. So there's a lot of risk in that approach, as well as it being quite a negative thing to be doing.
So, on this episode, we're going to be looking at tactical voting in depth. And I just suppose, in a nutshell, do you think it's a good idea?
Well, I think people shouldn't feel like they have to cast a tactical vote and it's so, easy and straightforward to make it a non-issue by having an electoral system where people can go and vote for exactly who they want to and vote on the basis of that party's policies, not on some strategic choice. we've got the current system we have. And so obviously it's, if voters want to make those choices, that is entirely up to them.
So it sounds like our electoral system certainly needs reform, as you would know. But why is it taking so long to move this up the agenda? And what is the resistance from the mainstream parties?
Well, the big issue here is, of course, that, the government needs to change the system or bring forward legislation to change the system. And our governments necessarily have just won an election under the previous system. So there's a bit of an inbuilt bias, which means that even, certainly in other countries where there's been big reform movements, even parties like promising reform when they get into power under that system and then sort of start rethinking whether they're just as keen on it as they were before. Right. So where you've seen change, you've seen more of a cross-party approach to it, or sometimes you've seen one party pick up the mantle of another party when they get into power. But I do think there are really strong reasons to do so. And I think everyone who gets into power needs to be thinking about not what does the next 4 years look like, but what does the next decade or 2 decades look like?
Joining us in the studio now is the writer and activist Femi Oluwole and Joe Twyman, co-founder and director of Delta Poll. Welcome, Femi and Joe. Joe, you're really kissing up to our parent company by wearing a Crooked Media T-shirt on the podcast.
Yes, this was a gift from an American admirer, and I'm a big fan of their podcast.
Wow, somehow it's managed to be both a kiss ass and a dig from Joe. Joe is wearing a friend of the pod T-shirt for the benefit of people, of everyone listening.
But crucially, not our pod.
I'm completely neutral. I'd like to make that clear from the outset. I have no strong opinions either way.
Yeah, that's fine. You're allowed to be partial about US politics.
Yeah, well, I don't necessarily think that's true.
Femi, you've had a busy couple of years since 2016, and how involved are you, and what sort of form is your campaigning taking in this election?
Right now, we're really focusing on A, getting out the vote, and B, the discussion around tactical voting, which is a massive discussion, especially among Gen Z on TikTok, because a lot of people are disillusioned with Labour. They've seen the direction that it's gone and aren't happy. But at the same time, after 14, 15 years, the Tories, we've got to get them out. And so there's a huge battle going on there. So I'm just trying to keep the peace.
Well, this is a perfect segue into what we're talking about today. This is perfect. Yeah, we want to discuss this idea of tactical voting. I mean, instinctively, Femi, just taking out the context of it, just instinctively on a personal level, how do you feel about tactical voting?
Tactical voting is a sign that our democracy isn't working, because you shouldn't have to vote tactically. The only reason why you have to vote tactically is because our voting system is broken. If in your town, let's say 30% vote Labour, 30% vote Green, and 40% vote Tory, then even though 60% of the people in your town want, generally speaking, progressive, left-leaning policies, you'll have a Tory MP. So the 60% of votes won't have any effect. If, however, the people in that constituency all tactically vote for the same party, the 60%, then they can oust the Tory, that sort of thing. That shouldn't happen. We should have a situation where if one party gets 30% of the votes, they get 30% of the seats. But unfortunately, we have a first-past-the-post system which doesn't allow that.
Joe, as a pollster and looking at the numbers, how does tactical voting stack up with reality? I mean, does it actually work?
Well, it depends what I mean by work. Does it change the overall result of an election? That's really difficult to test. If you go back to 2017, when it was really close between the Conservatives getting a small majority and ending up with the minority that they received, actually, when you look at it, the number of votes that needed to change hands was fewer than 100. And if that happened among the right people in the right constituency, that's the difference between a Conservative majority and a Conservative minority. So it can make an impact. But generally speaking, it tends to be talked up a lot more than it actually warrants, given that when you look at the data, as we do, the potential for impact is there, but the reality is something different.
Okay, let's hear some voices on both sides of the argument around tactical voting. So first up, the long-time proponent for tactical voting, Carol Vorderman, talking to Politics Joe.
My mission is to absolutely eviscerate them. Not just that they lose, but that they can't even form the opposition. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and tactical voting is the methodology with which we can deliver the absolute swipe, wipe them away, because that's what they deserve.
Okay, so Joe, obviously you're a neutral person. Your T-shirts have their own mind of their own electorally. But is Carol right? And is this, because listeners to this show will and have had various questions about what the best way is to remove the Tory government. Is Carol Vorderman correct?
Also, I would just follow up and say, she says this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I thought tactical voting's been going on for decades.
Well, it's certainly been a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity if you've never voted in an election and you intend to die before the next one, which may not be completely outside the realms of possibility. But yeah, every election is that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The reality is somewhat different. We ask people how interested they are in tactical voting, but we also ask them if tactical voting will play into their decision to vote. Around about 13% of respondents, so fewer than 1 in 7, said they are explicitly intending to vote tactically. Right. And then you have a further 11%, so just over 1 in 10, who say they prefer another party, but it stands no chance of winning in their constituency. In other words, tactical voting by another name. So you have roughly a quarter of people who are open to the potential of tactical voting. But that's only one element of it, because in order to vote tactically, you then need information about your constituency in order to come to the quote-unquote right conclusion about who to vote for tactically. And back in October, on the old constituencies, we ran a study asking respondents about the knowledge they had of their constituency. And only 3% of the people we spoke to in a nationally representative survey can say who came first, who came second, and the margin of victory. In other words, those 3 things that you need for making an informed choice. And that was before the boundaries changed. Yep. And so now it's very different. And so if people are going in not informed, then tactical voting is going to be largely neutralised again.
I remember reading about who votes tactically, and as I understand it, it tends to be older voters, and it tends to be wealthier voters, and it tends to be people who are university graduates. And that made me wonder...
But they're the people who say they vote tactically.
Right, I see.
But there is a question about whether, on this basis, whether they're actually voting tactically or whether they just believe they're voting tactically.
Right, I see.
It's one of those nuances of public opinion research.
So, Femi, is that the challenge then for groups that are trying to encourage people to vote tactically, is that you've got to close that knowledge gap, right?
Exactly. That's what Movement Forward is trying to do. They got thousands of people signed up to the local elections last year. Carol Vorderman spearheaded that. And so that's where we're looking to go. As far as it being a once-in-a-lifetime thing, the confluence of events on this one is A, you've got the opportunity to never have to vote tactically again. Why? Because the majority of the country is clearly in favour of changing the voting system to one where all votes count equally. The Labour Party's membership has voted explicitly for changing it from first past the post to PR. Now, the leadership is the problem. But if Labour gets in and we manage to work with the Labour members to get the leadership to change things, then this is the last time we'll ever have to vote tactically. So that's one element that's once in a lifetime. There's also the fact that the Tories are polling so low that we have a chance to potentially push them into third position, which is what the Movement Forward is trying to push for. Because if we end up in a situation where the actual party of opposition is the Lib Dems, that changes the landscape significantly, rather than Keir Starmer answering to either Rishi Sunak, Suella Braverman, or Nigel Farage.
He'd be answering to Rishi Sunak from California.
Can I come in on public support for this? You can test things in various different ways. You can test absolute support for tactical voting and indeed for electoral reform, and you find that actually the picture is mixed on that, and also it's simply very low down people's lists of priorities, and things can be done to change that. But my suspicion is that we won't see things change next time around unless it's driven by the Lib Dems in some form of coalition agreement. I can't see it. I can't see a situation where a party that has won on the current system, particularly as large as Labour may win on current polling, I don't see how that then translates into them saying, oh yeah, actually.
But that's always the problem.
No, exactly. And so the only time in recent memory, of course, where we have had this was when we had the coalition agreement with the Lib Dems, and that led to a referendum which was then soundly defeated. And
but it was defeated on the basis of AV.
There were lots of good reasons. So
proportional representation has never actually been put to the people. We've never had a chance to have equal votes about counting equally.
I completely agree, but I don't imagine, particularly in the political context, that it would have to take place. I don't imagine that if there were a vote next time around, it would.
And as far as it being mixed, if you look at YouGov, the polling consistently shows PR something like 45, 48%, and first past the post at like 20, 22%.
So PR would win, ironically, on a first past the post.
Yes.
Okay, so let's listen to Owen Jones. He's on Channel 5's Storm Huntley programme arguing against tactical voting.
I'm a lifelong Labour voter, but I'm voting for the Green Party for this general election for the first time in my life. The Tories are toast. There's no chance of the Tories winning. There's going to be a landslide victory. Spoiler, there's going to be a landslide victory for the Labour Party come what may. So people can vote according to their conscience in this election. I think if you vote for the Green Party, then you send a message to Labour.
So Femi, how do you respond to that? Because I mean, you've yourself said already so far that you have some frustrations with the Labour leadership. Isn't there an argument, if we're looking at a thumping Labour majority, that this is the time to at least send a message to the Labour Party as well? What Owen Jones was saying about this is an election to vote with your conscience, not necessarily to vote tactically.
Also, yeah, so with the group, the Movement Forward, then Stop the Tories.vote, the idea is not to try and get a huge thumping Labour majority. The idea is to keep the Tories out and ideally push the Tories down into third position. So there are many seats, at least over 100 seats so far that we've counted, where they're not actually giving advice on which party to vote for. They're saying vote with your heart. They're saying vote for whichever party you actually like. So they're just saying here are the places where you don't need to vote tactically as well. But in the areas where it is going to be a fine line between Labour and the Tories, the Lib Dems and the Tories, those are the seats where they're giving recommendations and saying vote Lib Dem here, vote Labour here, vote Green here.
Joe, how realistic is this conversation about the Conservatives possibly being pushed into third place? Don't threaten me with a good time. But I can't conceive of it. Surely this is, I mean, because the threat to the Conservatives posed by the Reform Party, surely that's too diffuse nationally in terms of the Reform vote to actually have an impact on the Tories' final seat count?
Yeah, I mean, second place can mean different things. In 1983, the the SDP Liberal Alliance ran the Labour Party very close in terms of share of the vote, and yet completely different in terms of share of the seats.
Okay, that's really important. Let's just walk people through that because we obviously have some younger listeners to the podcast who will not be as familiar with Shirley Williams and the leading figures of the SDP.
Bear with.
As some of us are, but just walk people through that. So there was a period for the 1983 election, a new political party had been formed that was sort of a breakaway group from bits of the, I guess, what you would call the moderate wing of the Labour Party, which at the time was being led by Michael Foot. And in the 1983 election, they stood as a third party. And they nationally, you're saying that they ran the Labour Party close in terms of how many votes they actually got.
That's right. Basically, a fringe group within the Labour Party broke off, formed the Social Democratic Party, which actually still exists, but is very different nowadays. And they joined up in a pact with the Liberals in the 1983 election, and so ran against Michael Foot's Labour Party and Margaret Thatcher's Conservatives. The Conservative Party go on to win 42% of the vote and 397 seats, so a whopping majority for Margaret Thatcher. The SDP Liberal Alliance wins 25.4% of the vote and Labour win 27.6%. So really close between the two in terms of share of the vote. And yet in terms of seats, well, the Labour Party won 209 and the SDP Liberal Alliance won 23. So a huge difference there. And I imagine that if Reform, and it is an if Reform do run the Conservatives close in terms of share of the vote, it will be similarly a huge gap in terms of the number of seats. The Conservatives' worst performance, up until now at least, was in 1997. They still won 165 seats then, 94 of which at the time had not changed hands since the Second World War. And so it's difficult to see how they can go significantly lower than that, and at the same time Reform pick up large numbers of seats across the country in order to overtake them in terms of seats.
Because whenever we have a conversation about tactical voting, and perhaps this is just revealing my own echo chamber, but it seems to be a conversation that happens amongst progressives, doesn't seem to be happening amongst people on the right side of the spectrum. Do you see that changing? So
it's already changed. Nigel Farage and Richard Tice at every opportunity are banging on about electoral reform, and I imagine if Labour do go on to win a big majority, then that post-Conservative government world and post-government Conservative Party will have to have some sort of informal or even formal discussions with reform. And what Tice and Farage are hoping is that the inequality, the such obvious inequality that they expect to occur as a result of the current voting system, will mean that the desire for electoral reform becomes so strong, not just from the traditional home on the left, but also in the new right, that the momentum snowballs and it becomes an inevitability. As I say, I don't think that's actually the most likely outcome, but that is certainly the play that Farage and Tice are making at the moment.
So, Femi, say what you will about Nigel Farage, he's good at forcing referendums.
Yeah.
Does that give you some weird hope that you might, from an unlikely source, receive the support that British politics needs to build a critical mass to have that conversation?
Yeah, I do expect that, because there's one election where Labour actually got fewer votes than the Tories, but still actually became the government of the time. So we have such an unfair system. So there are cases where proportional representation would actually favour the right. However, in every single election apart from 1955, 1959, and 2015. The majority of votes have gone to Labour, Lib Dems, SNP and the Greens. So parties that are, generally speaking, to the left of the Tories. That's who we generally are. So if we did have a proportional voting system, then yes, Nigel Farage, UKIP, Brexit Party, Reform Party, whatever they want to call themselves, would get some seats in Parliament, but the progressive majority, if things stay as they are, would be there, especially with Gen Z coming onto the voter base. I would also argue that it's also easier to challenge them in Parliament than it is to challenge them on back alley Facebook groups. So I'm actually okay with the idea of them getting seats in Parliament.
Femi, I do want to just ask you, just about, just emotionally, do you not feel concerned that tactical voting is just going to deepen people's disaffection with the voting system? We already have low voter turnouts, partly because people feel like their votes don't matter. And then in tactical voting, that is writ large. And actually, you have a small percentage of people, somewhere between 5% or 10%, whatever it might be, that can swing it even more. Isn't this deepening our problems with democracy?
Yeah, so that's why I keep saying that people say the argument between vote with your heart versus vote tactically is pointless unless you're saying...
But do two wrongs make a right, Femi?
No, well, this is the point. Neither side is right unless they say, and this is what we're going to do afterwards, because it's all about what happens after the election. If we consider that a Labour majority is inevitable, then the question isn't, how am I going to vote Green? Am I going to vote Labour? The question is, afterwards, am I going to be doing absolutely everything in my power to make sure that we end this first past the post voting system? Am I joining Make Votes Matter? Am I, which is the movement for a fair democracy? Am I signed up as a tactical voter? Am I working within the Labour Party to push for PR? Am I protesting in a way that makes it impossible for the government to function unless they give us a fair democracy? Unless you're doing those things, saying, oh, I'm not voting Labour or I am voting Labour is irrelevant.
So another argument for voting with your heart, I would say, comes from largely the Green Party, because if a party doesn't receive 5% of the vote in the electorate, they lose the £500 deposit that candidates have to put up to run in the election. And overwhelmingly, that hits the Greens hardest. In the 2019 election, the Green Party was far and away the biggest loser of deposits, losing a total of £232,500, whilst Labour and the Tories only lost £6,000 and £2,000, respectively. I mean, it's the Greens that come off worst from tactical voting, seemingly, Joe. Is that right?
I mean, it depends on how you characterise it. But yes, given that the Greens are very, very unlikely to win in all but maybe 2 or 3 constituencies at best, then yes, you could, if you were so inclined, characterise a vote for the Greens in any other constituencies as a wasted vote.
Yeah.
And so therefore the tactical solution is to vote for the party that you think will achieve what you want in that constituency, and that will hurt the Greens. But at the same time, if you remove the deposit limit, then you have issues with all sorts of people entering.
In December of 2014, Judge Lawyer died at a wedding in Nagpur, India, of a heart attack. And at the time, his passing barely made the news.
But when his niece approached a journalist 2 years later, she shared a different narrative, that the circumstances around Judge Brijgopal Lawyer's death have made his family doubt the official story.
Killing Justice, hosted by CEO of the branch Ravi Gupta, follows the reporting and the legal fallout from this tip.
He examines the conflicting evidence to answer how one man's death became a magnet for the increasingly polarised politics in India and what this means for the future of the world's largest democracy.
Listen to the first 4 episodes of Killing Justice on Spotify or Apple. For ad-free episodes, join the Friends of the Pod community at crooked.com/friends. One of the things that people say is good about first past the post is it enables Commons, the House parties, to get things done. Like the coalitions were all just going to be arguing and everything will get stalemate. I mean, what do you think about that? Is that...
So it's important to remember that in Europe, there is only one other country that uses first past the post, and even partially, and that's Belarus, which is often referred to as Europe's last dictatorship. So we're not in great company there. As far as the idea of getting things done, the idea is saying that we want a situation where a party that only a minority of people voted for can do whatever they want, to hell with the views of the parties on the other parties, even though the majority of people voted for those parties. And if you want a party that only a minority support to be able to do whatever they want, that's not democracy, that's the other thing.
I'm not here to defend one political system
You
or
are
political
neutral.
party. I'm neutral.
We know.
You're systemically neutral as well as politically neutral.
to my very core or other parts of my body.
I've got a Samsung and an iPhone.
Exactly. So I'm not here to defend one political system over another, nor am I here to defend one political party over another. But what I will say is that one of the arguments for first past the post is that it helps, to some extent, keep extreme parties out. And that if you have even with a threshold in there, there can be enough support nationwide for particularly sectarian parties from a particular religious group, or with a particular single
Bin
platform.
Face is taking a seat. Count Bin Face. Here he is.
And all of this could be damaging for the health of the democracy. So there are arguments for and against, which I'm sure some people out there would want me.
Yeah,
to,
I'm sure that. Yeah, I
think.
think that's a difficult situation you find yourself in, because then the counter argument to that is, the last 14 years we've essentially seen the Conservative Party genuflect to the right flank to such an extent that they've essentially handed Nigel Farage everything that he's wanted. Nigel Farage has had the most influence on the Conservative Party's direction in the last decade, particularly, without having to win a seat in it. So there's problems with both systems.
Exactly, and there are lots and lots of Conservative voters who have seen the direction the Conservative Party has taken. They've seen it move to the right, to a place that they've had to follow because the alternative was Jeremy Corbyn, and they hate Jeremy Corbyn. So they've got to keep following the Conservative Party as it moved further to the right. That two-party system enabled extremism.
Well, let's talk about 3 specific seats just before we wrap up that are I'm solely raising because it would be funny if the incumbent MP went. The highest profile MP who seems to be under the most threat in their seat is Jeremy Hunt. Hunt himself has told Bloomberg that the seat is probably going to be won by the Conservatives by 1,500 votes or fewer. As recently as 2015, he had a majority of 30,000, which now feels like a lifetime ago. Is there a possibility that the current Chancellor of the Exchequer could lose his seat on election night?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a possibility, and I think on the current polling, it's certainly possible. What I would caution, however, is that it's actually very difficult to estimate with any degree of certainty, because constituency level polls, because we have only around 70,000 people in each of the constituencies, constituency level polling is very expensive and very difficult to do well, and so generally speaking, it isn't done. And so we don't have great individual polling. Also, things like MRP polls that do estimate individual constituencies can't take account or don't take account of hyper-local factors.
Just define MRP for us.
Well, it's multi-level regression with post-stratification weighting, Nish,
course.
as I'm sure you know.
I know that, but I just wanted to make sure the listeners knew that.
Or for the should there, in the unlikely event, be any listeners who don't understand what that means, let me explain very briefly. The way to think about it is like a Lego set. When we do a conventional poll, we have a big pile of Lego and then we try and split that up into individual constituencies and estimate what those constituencies will be based on something like uniform swing and how votes move from one party to another. The way MRP does it is it's like lots of individual blocks where each block, the result of each block is modelled using statistical techniques, and then that's all added up to make the big Lego set. And that can be used to estimate individual constituencies, and in the past has had some success in doing that. But as I say, you can't take account of hyper-local factors. And something like incumbency, something like a quote-unquote famous MP can make a difference. But that raises, of course, the spectre of the Portillo moment.
Yep.
Those of us who were old enough to remember 1997, Femi, will remember how Michael Portillo lost his seat in Enfield. But the thing about that Portillo moment was it was actually a surprise.
Right.
Those of us who were watching it thinking, my goodness, my analysis says even Portillo might lose his seat.
Yeah.
It was a shock when it happened still. This time around, because the Conservatives are doing so badly, I almost feel like there won't be any Portillo moments because everyone will be saying, well, of course Hart lost his seat.
I'm sad to hear that we can't, count our chickens because Jacob Rees-Mogg is another one who's up for it.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, there's been a boundary change and his constituency now includes a lot of Lib Dem voters. So...
Well,
can we start to enjoy a bit?
Well, the thing about, obviously I can't enjoy it because I'm politically neutral. I can't stress that enough, Coco. But actually, that's a really good illustration of the kind of seats the Lib Dems are going for. That whole swathe of seats in the southwest was basically the Lib Dem heartland through Paddy Ashdown, then Charles Kennedy, then Nick Clegg. But after 2015, things got worse for the Lib Dems in that area. David Cameron's Conservative Party in 2015, to some surprise, came through and swept all of those constituencies up. And the Lib Dems, if they're going to fight back in any area, probably need to start there more than anything else. And so that brings a lot into play. Now, Jacob Rees-Mogg's constituency is slightly different, and I think others will go before his goes. But I think it's certainly possible that could be another area.
So, Femi, is that a target constituency for a tactical vote? I mean, if there is a case to be made for tactical voting, it's absolutely you could get rid of Jacob Rees-Mogg from the House of Parliament.
Especially if it means giving a boost to the Lib Dems, who have the best chance of sort of potentially edging out the Tories in terms of second place. That's the hope. As far as Jeremy Hunt goes, I'd say that if it is likely that he might lose his seat, that every junior doctor in the country needs to go there for election night.
Okay, so then my final question on this is Rishi Sunak. Okay, this is the Prime Minister. He has a big majority in his seat. Is there even an outside chance? Because one of the characteristics of Richmond in North Yorkshire is that it does have a very large military population that live there. And Rishi Sunak has, I think this is a technical term, taken a dump on his rep a little bit. Is there any possibility that Rishi Sunak loses his seat on election?
Well, I can only assume you're referring to Delta Poll's latest survey for the Mail on Sunday, just gone.
Thank you.
Where smooth.
Exactly. You see what I did there. That's Delta Poll with a D. We ran a survey that showed that the Labour Party is at the moment enjoying a 25% lead over the Conservatives. Now, polls were only ever a snapshot of public opinion at the time, but nonetheless, that's an enormous lead. And if you were, and it's a big if, but if you were to apply uniform national swing to that, so in other words, the idea that the swing from Conservative to Labour in that national poll is replicated in every individual constituency, on that basis, Rishi Sunak would lose his seat. But inevitably, it's more complicated than that. As I say, hyperlocal factors would have to come into play, but they work both ways. Tactical voting could be particularly powerful. And if it's going to work anywhere, you could argue Rishi Sunak's seat would be the seat where people were energised to vote against him and to look into it. There's also the argument about whether actually he's trying very hard in his own constituency, because prime ministers campaigning in their own constituency is not really something that happens. Of course, it's very complicated in that respect, and he may simply not want it. I mean, I've never been a billionaire's husband, but it does strike me as a job that I could do well, firstly, and secondly that I'd really enjoy, and so maybe there is an element of that, and he just thinks actually, would it be better if we're going down in a blaze of glory, or lack of, would it be better for me to lose my seat so I can leave immediately? I'm not suggesting that's actually the case, but the fact that his seat is potentially up for grabs, the fact that we are even having this conversation is such an illustration of the situation that the Conservatives find themselves in as the polls stand at the moment.
Now, if you're interested in voting tactically, there's loads of resources available. You can check out getvoting.org, tactical.vote, stopthetories.vote, or just Google tactical voting. Some of these resources are based on 2019 results, and since then, there has been boundary changes. Some mix and match with the current polling as well. Some take a different tack, for example, Sprint for PR, which instead aims to achieve a left-leaning hung parliament. They do that through tactical voting. So we encourage you to have a look at this information, no matter how you choose to vote. And just a reminder, please enroll to vote. The deadline is the 18th of June. That's next Tuesday. You'll need a photo ID to register, and postal vote registration closes at the same time.
gov.co.uk/register to vote. It's very important that you do that, because otherwise, what the fuck have we been doing this goddamn podcast for? Joe, Femi, thank you so much for joining us. And that was a great discussion.
It's been fine.
Thank you.
He cannot take a position. Thanks for listening to Pod Save the UK. If you have any news from your own backyard or any other comments you want to share or topics you want us to look into, email us at psuk@reducedlistening.co.uk. We'd really love to hear your voices, so if you're feeling brave and want to ask us a question, send us a voice note on WhatsApp. Our number is 07494 933 444. Internationally, that's +44 7494 933 444.
Don't forget to follow at PodSaveTheUK on Instagram, TikTok and Twitter. You can also find us on YouTube for full access to episodes, and you can drop us a review too if you like.
Pod Save the UK is a reduced listening production for Crooked Media.
Thanks to senior producer James Tyndale, assistant producer John Rogers and digital producer Alex Bishop.
The video editor is Nada Smiljanic, and our theme music is by Vasilis Fotopoulos.
Thanks to our engineer Alex Bennett.
The executive producers are Anishka Sharma, Dan Jackson and Madeline Herringer, with additional support from Ari Schwartz.
And remember to hit subscribe for new shows on Thursdays on Amazon, Spotify, Apple or wherever you get your podcasts.